In this installment, Deborah Watkins is being interviewed by Dennis Stow on the topic of rights to extend or renew a lease.
So, Deb, why does a tenant want a right to extend or renew the term of a lease?
Having these rights give tenants flexibility and control over their future. The right to stay in place can be very important. It's not a value to the landlord, however, because it's a matter that's totally in the tenant's option and the tenant's control.
Is there a difference between a renewal right and an extension right?
There definitely is. The legal effect of exercising a renewal right is that the original lease ends with the expiry of the term, and a new lease begins with the commencement of the renewal term. But with an extension, the term is simply lengthened. The distinction can be really important at times. For example, special rights like options to expand, rights of first refusal, and rights of first offer can be lost on a renewal. Dennis, you had a situation with the loss of a right on a renewal.
Yes, that's right. I was involved in a situation where a department store tenant had a first right to lease space next to its store in a shopping center if it became available for leasing. But the right was lost when the department store tenant renewed its lease. It worked out well for the landlord because the landlord had inadvertently gone ahead and leased the space to a third party. The landlord was relieved when we advised it that the department store's right did not continue during the renewal period because the right wasn't expressed as applicable during renewal periods. From a tenant's perspective, what should they be concerned about including in the option to renew or extend?
The right must clearly outline the terms on which the tenant has the right to stay on. If the right to renew or extend is on terms to be agreed upon by the parties, that's just an agreement to agree, and it's not enforceable. The duration of the term and rental rate, or if a specific rental rate is not included, a method of determining it are all important. Where the renewal and the extension rights typically run into trouble is on setting the rent to be paid. Often the rental rate is expressed as fair market net rent for similar premises in a similar building in a similar location. That formulation outlines enough objective criteria to be enforceable. But where there's no objective criteria, or if there's no mechanism for resolving disagreement when the parties can't agree on the rent, then the tenant might wind up with no right to extend or renew at all.
What about the landlord's perspective?
Usually the tenant's exercise of the right is subject to certain preconditions. For example, the right can be made personal to the named tenant, can be available only if the tenant is not and has not been in default under the lease, and it can and should contain requirements for written notice and specific timing for exercise of the right. Courts have been sticky about adherence to preconditions, and in particular about notice periods. Tenants who fail to observe the notice-giving requirements usually lose their rights.
Most extension or renewal rights specify that they're on the same terms and conditions as the lease. Is there anything to worry about in that phrase?
Yes, because sometimes certain terms should not apply during the extension or renewal period. Things like fixturing and rent-free periods, landlord's work, and other tenant inducements typically don't get refreshed in a renewal or extension scenario. One of the classic accidental outcomes of using the phrase same terms and conditions is that the option to renew or extend is itself renewed. So at the very least, the phrase same terms and conditions should make an exception for the number of options that remain.
Well, how about referring rent disputes to arbitration? Is that a helpful process?
That's a much larger conversation. But the short answer is yes. The reference to the arbitration process is helpful because it promotes an out-of-court settlement. While the arbitration process is awful, referencing it can be useful.
That was Deborah Watkins in conversation with Dennis Stow on the topic of rights to extend or renew a lease. If you would like to learn more, contact Deborah on our website, dv-law.com.
This audio recording was a general discussion and should not be relied upon as legal advice.